Dr. Madhav. Um, Just to reiterate the simple basic question of beginning, before beginning an online session, hopefully I'm audible clearly to everyone. If you could confirm, please.
You are audible.
Thank you so much. All right, then let me simply load up my slides and then we begin. Just a second. All right. So basically, what my lecture is going to be revolving around is well, is to simply construct an introduction to children's literature. Now, when we say children's literature, it becomes a little bit vague. For instance, for instance, we are seriously unsure about, is it just a sort of a literature which is written for children? Or is it a literature which is written by children? It's almost on a similar manner of me asking you, it's this sort of ambiguity which in fact creates a little bit of an issue while defining the term children's literature. For instance, is children's literature just specifically for children? Is it so that adults cannot enjoy it? If that is the case, what is a sort of a literature which, in fact, which basically is optimized just for children, or is it just optimized for a person who is unable to read or does not have an academic inclination towards it? So, children's literature, if I am to define it particularly, it is a body of written works which generally encompasses text as well as illustrations as well as other media, which is produced in order to entertain or else instruct young people. This is a sort of a genre which encompasses a wide range of works, which it's generally includes works from classic world literature to picture books to easy to read stories written which are exclusively written for children. Could be fairy tales, could be fables, lullabies, or even orally transmitted stories, folk songs, or even your comic books. Pick up a Batman comic book from your local store or a Tinkle from your local store, and that is also a sort of a children's literature, isn't it? Now, children's literature firstly emerged as a very distinct and independent form of a literature in the second half of the 18th century. And still now it has become, till now it is a subject which is widely debated upon and it is widely worked upon as well. During the 20th century, however, its growth has been quite remarkable in nature. And in fact, because of it, it has been of a particular interest to the academics of the modern and the postmodern era. Now, when I use the word children literature, it could obviously encompass, as I said before, it could encompass starting from comics to rhymes to everything in between. So let's start with something very simple, shall we? For instance, as you can see on my screen right now, we have this nursery rhyme, which, well, almost each and every one of us have heard of, right? It's the Humpty Dumpty. So what was the Humpty Dumpty doing? He was sitting on a wall, and then he has a great fall, and then all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together again. Now, when we take a look at this particular sort of a poem or a nursery rhyme, as we can call it more specifically, on its on this very surface of it, it's quite simplistic in nature, isn't it? I mean, there was an egg whose name was Humpty Dumpty. He was sitting on some sort of a wall, and this anthropomorphic egg then had a great fall, as the poem says. And since the egg is now broken, now it cannot be put together by even the king's men and the king's horses. So the question then remains is that why would a king's man or why would a king's horse be in fact interested in putting an egg back together? So obviously we're missing something, right? Obviously there is some sort of a research which is to be conducted, or obviously there is some sort of a background information which is missing over here. Now, upon closer inspection, if you in fact research on it a little bit, what you will obviously uncover is that the Humpty Dumpty over here is a metaphor which is used for King Richard III of England. And after his terrible defeat from the French, he was in fact unable to gain the sort of respect that he had in front of all the British noblemen. And because of that, we have this king who is now being described as an egg, an anthropomorphic egg, who cannot even get, I mean, who cannot rise up to his position as before. Now, this is just one of the examples. I had another example which I had lined up for you, and this is another one which you have pretty much all heard about, right? Which is Ring Around the Rosie. Ring around the rosy is a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. Now, I mean, this is a poem from the 1600s, or more specifically the 1660s. And generally, when you may definitely hear the song I mean, among the nursery kids or in playgrounds or wherever. But again, when you take a closer look upon it, some of the sentences don't make sense. For instance, why would you be carried a pocket full of posies? A posy is basically a sort of a bouquet of fragrant flowers. And why would you fall down at the end of your merry dance? It doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? So, upon closer inspection, when you research a little bit further on it, what you will find out is that this is actually alluding to the Great Black Plague of the 1660s. And uh, plague had this I mean, the plague had a symptom of red, painful pustules. And that is what they're saying, a ring around the rosy. And then, in fact, the people who would be afflicted with the disease, they would, in fact, have really bad odor about them. And because of that, you would be carrying fragrant flowers with you so that you would not, well, stink. And the third line, which has in fact been changed over the course of many years, the third line used to read ashes to ashes, which obviously is a reference to the fact that at that point of time, since people were dying in such large numbers, it was quite difficult for the townspeople to in fact bury all of them, and hence they were all burned. I mean, they were actually burned, and because of that, we have this song which reads something like, which is in fact a tale of what happened during the plague. That means that, well, you would have painful pustules, and then there would be bad odor about you. And then finally, after that, you will be burned and you wouldn't even be getting a proper burial. And finally, we all are going to share this similar fate. And hence, now when you take a look at the song, you now look at it from a very different angle now, don't you? And these are some of the historical things which are associated with even the simplest of the nursery rhymes. So when we try to, in fact, think about things, then obviously there is a lot of deeper understanding which we need to gather of even the most simplistic of literary works. And that is what children's literature, in fact, takes it upon itself to uncover. Now, if you think about the word itself, children's literature, the first issue over here is defining who this literature is meant for. For instance, I mean, if I say the word children, I may refer to all potential young literate people, right? Or from the instant that they can, in fact, enjoy a leaf of a book, may it be in the form of picture, may it be in the form of a simple poem, such as these, to the age of perhaps 14 or 15, to their adolescence. They may be called as children. And thus, this is the sort of a literature which is meant for children and young people. Now, it again raises the question that if that is the case, are adults not supposed to enjoy this sort of literature? But that is also incorrect. Of course, if you think about certain children's books, such as Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, or if you think about Winnie the Pooh by E. A. Milne, then you can understand very clearly that these are supposed to be read by people of all ages. Hence, children's literature is quite misleading if we think that this literature is just meant for children. Next, moving on, if we think about the term literature over here, the second part of it, then children's literature is more importantly I mean, it's not generally literature of a specific region, but it's more specifically world literature. It can come under the vast field of world literature. For most of the part, this adjective imaginative is to be felt by, I mean, this adjective is used to, I mean, the most generally the word children, in fact, is used to classify it, or in fact to categorize it into into one form of literature. But more generally, you can in fact use this particular genre or this vast corpus of literature under world literature. It comprises of this vast expanding territory, which is recognizably stayed out for junior audience, and which does not mean that it is not intended for seniors, but mostly for junior audience. Adults can make up the part of this population as well. And children's books are written for, which are selected for publication, which are supposed to be sold and to be bought and to be reviewed, and often read aloud by grown-ups as well. Sometimes they seem to be written with adults in their mind. As for example, if you think about the French cartoons called as Asterix, it's a very popular French comic book cartoon, which you can find in certain newspapers in our country as well. And if you think about this Asterix comic book series, it is enjoyable by both children, but a person who is, in fact, a little bit well versed in history can understand the hidden parody which is contained within it. So, nevertheless, by and large, what we can say is that it is a sovereign republic of children's literature. There's a specific area designated for this sort of a literature. And if we are to move on, in fact, to particulars of it, these are certain topics that I thought that we should, in fact, discuss in a little bit of detail so that we can, in fact, understand what does this field encompass and how, in fact, you as a student of literature could perhaps approach it. Now, let's start from the very beginning and let's go on with the common assumptions which are associated with this literature. And the first common assumption which is associated with it is the simplicity and the obviousness. Now, we can see from the two examples that we use from the very beginning of this class and from the very beginning of this lecture are the examples of two very popular nursery rhymes. On the surface of it, they are quite simplistic in nature, and their meaning is quite obvious in nature as well. Now, simplicity does not act. I mean, it's not that their simplicity should not invite criticism, but it is often assumed that it is meant to be silly, so that it could immediately gratify a child, so that it could be rhyming, it could be catchy, it could be humorous, and thus it does not in fact perhaps require specific sort of an attention, and it does not actually require intellectual or creative gymnastics to understand what is the meaning which is contained within it. Now, if we think about such a topic, critics such as Francilia Butler, who has in fact helped establish the first scholarly journal devoted to children's literature, wrote about about resistance to studying it critically. What she says is that many arguments have been advanced to justify the situation, and it is often repeated that children's literature is so simple and obvious that any fool can understand it, and it doesn't require study. However, what she says is that if children's literature is so simple, then there is no special preparation or tools which are needed to understand it, and a course or a book on children's literature would be highly unnecessary in nature. For some, the very familiarity with the children's stories as represented uh, could, in fact, create an impression of simplicity. However, linguistically or thematically, they could be even more complex while appearing otherwise on the outside. Hence, the idea is that even more attention should be provided to this proverbial wolf in the sheep's clothing. For instance, I mean, it's obviously that. For instance, if you think about it, it's actually a kind of a literature which parades as simplistic, but which demands even more and more attention from your side for us to uncover the hidden meaning inside of it, or to uncover why it was written, or to uncover for what purpose, or for what purpose it was originally written as. Now, another, argument, another common assumption which academics or even students who begin to study this form of literature have is that children's literature is often pure and it is innocent and it is uncontroversial. And the issue with this sort of a literature is, and since it is devoid of elements which are well associated with adults and adult culture, such as perhaps racial discrimination or violence or trauma or sexuality or class distinction, it perhaps does not, in fact, because it lacks these sort of features, perhaps it doesn't garner our attention at all. However, as you can see on the slide itself, children's literature in depicting the lives, pleasures, fears, and anxieties of children often includes elements that might seem upsetting or too mature in content. The frequent controversies that surround these books and numerous attempts to limit children's access to them point to the inclusion of such sophisticated elements, which I just mentioned before, and even some adults find such works disturbing. Children live in a world which is primarily created by the adults, and so no strict, and therefore there is no strict line which in fact divides the experiences or environments for this younger members of the society or community. We should therefore expect to find elements associated with the adults, adult culture, history, in these works of children's literature. Now, of course, all of these common assumptions that I'm going to be telling you right now, I'll be obviously making a few examples when I reach the end of the list. And this is our final point. And that is, critical analysis takes the fun out of reading children's literature. For instance, you can also say that, well, what's the point of me analyzing a poem like Humpty Dumpty? Or what's the point of me analyzing a poem such as London Bridge is Falling Down? Wouldn't it take the fun out of it? Wouldn't it ruin the whole scene? Wouldn't it, in fact, ruin it for the children who are, in fact, studying it? Now, there are some academics who, in fact, do consider that critically analyzing children's literature ruins the work of their childhood and the memories which you, in fact, associate with it. But such a resistance rejects the assumptions that children's literature is only primarily a source of a pure sort of a pleasure, and in fact, because of it, the children and the nostalgia which are associated with it for adults and critical thinking interferes with such a kind of a pleasure. Some readers do not want to discover that they did not understand all the meanings or the implications of a text that they were children, or they might not want to create new understandings at all that could compete with these older worldviews. Now, in such a scenario, children's literature is simply meant to be enjoyed without requiring too much of effort. However, understanding how these texts work and how they can mean actual can in fact contribute to one's reading pleasure. So that is why, in fact, we as academics should in fact take a closer look upon this sort of a literature and in fact try to unearth the hidden meaning which is hidden inside of it. Now, if I am to in fact show you all of these assumptions, I would like you to take back to the story of Hansel and Gretel. Now, if you are unaware of this particular short story, in fact, I did download a video of it, and I'll be presenting it very shortly to you so that the students who are unaware of this particular short story as well would be able to understand it. So please give me a second.
A long time ago, a woodcutter lived on the edge of a large forest with his two children, a girl named Gretel and his son named Hansel, and his wife who was the children's stepmother. They were very poor, despite all the hardcutter's hard work. One year there was a terrible famine, and there was not enough food for the whole family. One night, the stepmother told the woodcutter they must take Hansel and Gretel deep into the forest and leave them there. Hansel overheard them talking. He told Gretel the terrible plan. Then Hansel had a great idea. He would fill his pockets with white pebbles to leave a path back to the house when this happened. The next morning, the stepmother said they all had to go into the woods to gather firewood. As they walked deeper and deeper into the woods, Hansel dropped his white pebbles to mark the path back to their house. The next day, Hansel and Gretel returned back to the house. Their stepmother was very angry. She told the woodcutter to take them deeper into the woods. This time, Hansel marked their path with breadcrumbs from his pocket so they could find their way home. In the morning, there were no breadcrumbs. The woodland animals had eaten them all. Hansel and Gretel began to walk through the forest, and suddenly, they could not believe their eyes. They found the most amazing house, made of gingerbread, with a roof of icing and windows made of sugar. They were so hungry, they broke off a piece of the house to eat. Then they heard a voice. "Nibble, nibble like a mouse. Who's that nibbling at my house?" The door opened, and an old woman leaning on a cane frightened Hansel and Gretel. The woman then smiled and invited Hansel and Gretel into her house for a delicious dinner of pancakes and apples. After dinner, she said they could stay for the night, and she made up the beds for them, as sweet and kind as any grandmother. The children had no idea the old woman was really a wicked witch. Before Hansel and Gretel awoke the next morning, the wicked witch carried Hansel to a cage she had built and locked him inside. "Now I can fatten you up so I can eat you." The witch made Gretel cook, so Hansel would grow plump. The children cried and begged to be set free, but the wicked witch just laughed at them. Every day the wicked witch, who could not see very well, wanted to feel Hansel's fingers through the bars of the cage, so she could feel how plump he was getting, plump enough to eat. But Hansel cleverly only gave her an old bone to feel. She thought he was always much too thin for her to eat. Weeks went by, and the witch was becoming impatient, as Hansel didn't seem to be growing any fatter. One morning, the witch ordered Gretel to make a fire in the oven. After a while, the witch said to Gretel, "Climb up into the oven to see if the fire is ready." Gretel asked, "But how can I get into the oven to see?" The witch was impatient and climbed up herself to show Gretel how to look at the fire. Quick as a wink, Gretel shoved the old witch into the oven. Then she banged the door shut. Gretel ran over to free Hansel from the cage. They now had nothing to be afraid of. They explored the witch's house and found jewels and gold coins in every corner. Hansel and Gretel filled their pockets with all the riches and gold coins, and they set out to find their way home. They walked for a long time and finally came to the edge of a big lake. "How can we ever cross without a bridge or a boat?" said Hansel. "Here comes a swan," said Gretel. "I will ask her to help us." The beautiful swan agreed to carry them across the lake. Once they were on the other side, they recognized the forest edge, and they began to run down the path towards home. When the woodcutter saw them running towards him, he cried tears of joy for seeing his children. He did not have a moment of peace since he had left them in the forest. His wife had died while they were gone. The children emptied their pockets of all the gold, rubies, and diamonds. The father could not believe his eyes. The woodcutter, Hansel, and Gretel all lived happily ever after, with the help of the witch's gold and treasures.
So, as we say, on the surface of it, it's quite simplistic again. The point which I have been trying to reiterate several times now. But upon closer inspection, well, there are several issues over here, aren't there? I mean, starting from child endangerment to child abuse to, well, intended cannibalism to, in fact, straight up murder. And that too, in fact, if you do read the original Brothers Grimm version of it, then you'll find that while Gretel pushed the old witch into the oven. The old witch was crying, and then she was screaming, and then she was burnt to a crisp. So, if you are, I mean, if you in fact think about such horrific terms of death of an elderly person, then it becomes very disturbing, isn't it? And all of our assumptions that we have been making about children's literature, which is that it is happy, it is, in fact, I mean, it is happy, in fact, it is quite simplistic, they are all thrown out the window. Even when we start to think about it for a minute. In fact, another thing which you can, in fact, think about is also a very simple concept of why, in fact, in all of these Brothers Grimm stories, I mean, in almost all the fairy tales, why is there always a stepmother who is shown as a villainous character? Have you ever thought about it? For instance, think about Cinderella, think about Snow White, think about, well, Hansel and Gretel. Everywhere there is this old stepmother who is in fact involved somewhere or the other, who in fact does harm the kids in some way or the other again. So these are some of the characteristics that jump out of the story as soon as you start looking at all of these a little bit more carefully. So the next question obviously becomes about how to in fact read them or how to in fact analyze such texts. And the first point of critically examining any sort of a text is, of course, reading it closely. As you can see on the slide, I have already written the practice of close reading involves paying careful attention to the language of the text, including the histories and meanings of the words and their connotations. The critic searches for the implications of the use of particular words and explores how language is used to produce different sort of meanings. Now, that is true for almost each and every sort of a literature, but reading critically also involves an awareness of literary history. It is about being aware of what happened where. It's also about how literature has changed over the time. And that is, in fact, what is going to provide you evidence of change or, let's just say, evolution in literature. Also, you should be aware of the different movements, the different genres, the techniques, and the evolution of forms as well. Being able to situate a text in a particular literary movement or to recognize how it reacts or how it modifies or how in fact it designs the conventions of a specific genre, it helps us to direct the reader's attention and in fact prompts discoveries that in fact might have gone overlooked. The second point, of course, is examining the historical and cultural context. A critical reader of children's literature also examines how the historical and cultural context of the author react to the composition of their work and its reception by readers, ideologies, and discourses, and which circulating at a given time and in a given place of influence or construct how individuals see the world by itself. So when we think about this particular method and how to, I mean, when we see the examples which I have given you before, for instance, think about the short story which we saw a few minutes ago, Hansel and Gretel, and I, in fact, asked you to consider a question about why, in fact, stepmothers of these early I mean 1800s, I mean 1700s to 1800s stories are being shown as such villainous characters. Well, the answer is quite simple. At a certain point of time, the Church of Britain did not want you to get remarried, and in fact, to drive home this particular convention that they had established, they would in fact portray and they would in fact propagate this idea that if you would marry another woman, then that person is going to be this sort of a villainous character who is going to create trouble for yourself and your children and nothing else. So you see how we in fact took up a small historical detail to identify such a context over here. And when we think about it, virtually all aspects of culture and society are altered through or they're constructed by ideological and discursive frameworks that shape or create our thought and perception. We are often influenced by such historical and cultural context without even being fully aware of those influences. Even what seems like individual choices, such as what we wear, what we pursue romantically, as we see in the case of the stepmothers, they are significantly encouraged or discouraged or enabled or disabled or, in fact, constrained and sometimes even prevented by our historical and cultural contexts. Finally, using critical and theoretical concepts and approaches. Now, as you can see that since the 1960s, we have something called as literary theory, right? So when we think about literary theory, these are certain approaches that you might have heard of already, which includes deconstruction, feminist and gender theory, historicist and Marxist approaches, reader response theories, psychoanalysis, post-colonial theory, biographical analysis, disability theory, eco-criticism, and queer theory. Each critical theory approach is unique. I mean, it offers a unique focus and its own set of questions, and each is associated with a vocabulary and a set of concepts which we are to think about while writing about literature now, isn't it? When we think about such different forms of theories which we have covered, it in fact provides us different worldviews. Basically, they in fact provide us with different points of view, in fact, and these terms and concepts in fact provide us a critical framework which gives shape to our analysis, and it helps to direct a critic's attention by generating useful lines of inquiry, and it provides us tools as well with which we can hypothesize the answers and in fact develop explanatory claims. Reading critically benefits from the familiarity with the critical approaches, and even in a specific project which integrates multiple approaches and something which we nowadays are calling as interdisciplinary work. So if we are to use these theories properly, let's go over and see how we can use it in an old American nursery rhyme, which I'm pretty sure you must have heard about, which is called as Yankee Doodle. And if you haven't heard about it, then no issues. I also have downloaded a very short poem regarding it. I mean, it's a nursery rhyme, so yes, I do have it over here somewhere. Just a second.
Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and the step, and would the girls be handy? Father and I went down to camp along with Captain Gooding, and there we saw the men and boys as thick as hasty pudding. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and the step, and would the girls be handy? There was Captain Washington upon a slapping stallion, giving orders to his men. I guess there were a million. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and the step, and would the girls be handy? Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony.
So we saw that small poem, right? Yankee Doodle, and this is the lyrics for it. And this is the quintessential American nursery rhyme. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap, and called it macaroni. From the very first stanza itself, several things are jumping out over here, isn't it? For instance, like why is he riding a pony, or why is he called as a Yankee Doodle? I mean, we all know that Americans are called as Yankee, but what's the point of a Yankee Doodle? And in fact, why is he calling a feather in his cap a macaroni? Macaroni is, of course, a form of pasta, isn't it? So, out of the very first four lines, we see that several questions have jumped out right over here. Now, Yankee Doodle, if you take a look at the historical references over here, it is obviously referring to the American War of Independence, where in fact Americans fought against the British when they fought against their British counterparts for the independence of the for the new world. And at that point of time, the Americans were called as Yankees, and Doodle was in fact a kind of a fool, like a Shakespearean fool. And we have this song which was originally designed by the British to mock the Americans. However, with due course of time, when the British did lose this particular war, they were in fact marched out of the American colonies with this particular song playing on drums. And hence it became, this song which was used, in fact, mock at the Americans, was later on used by the Americans themselves to subvert the whole ideology of their own existence and their own identity. And what they started doing is that they started calling themselves as the Yankee Doodles or the Yankee Fools, basically. And why is he calling a feather in his cap Macaroni? Because, well, Macaroni at that point of time, in fact, was a person who was quite well versed with the modern fashion, and you might have heard of terms such as bows and dandies from the 17 and the 1800s, right? So macaroni is a similar term in this particular respect. So out of the first four lines itself, what we can in fact understand is, upon using all of the methods that we did study a little bit earlier, we can look at this whole of the poem from a new angle altogether. And in fact, when we are adding the angle of the American War of Independence, now this line of yes, father and I went down to the camp along with Captain Gooding, and there we saw men and boys as thick as hasty pudding. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy, mind the music and the step, and the girls be handy. So right over here we see about Captain Washington as well, and this whole thing starts to make a little bit more sense rather than a nonsensical nursery rhyme. Now we get the idea of this dual nature, perhaps, of this short of a poem. And this brings us to, in fact, why, in fact, we should critically examine such poems as well. The first is obviously the dual address and complexity. Now, here is the name of a critic which I have provided. In fact, over here we have provided the names of several critics, and if you would want to, you can note them down and refer to them later. Barbara Wall, who in fact coined the term of dual address to describe the way in which some works for children move between addressing child readers and addressing adult readers, while you see Note Marcher and Sandra L. Beckett use the terms cross-writing to refer to the practice of writing for children and adults at the same point of time. Because of the dual address or practice of cross-writing, some children's literature appeals to the sensibilities of adult readers and contains allusions or references aimed at adult audience. Now, what it means is that, yes, even when we take a look at a simple poem such as Yankee Doodle, what we find is that we have this man who is riding into a town on his horse and is looking really fashionable. And in fact, the narrator is also advising him to be careful with the ladies, to be handy with the ladies, in fact, so that he could impress them. But at the same point of time, when we look a little bit further than the initial screening, we can find a lot of allusions to the grandeur of the American army during the Revolution. And when, in fact, even if we ditch this particular example, let's take an example which you might already have come across. A book such as Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, which was written sometime during the 1860s. And it is, in fact, quite a complex work of art. And it has a sophisticated and extensive vocabulary. In fact, a lot of Carroll's work, if you take a look at, the vocabulary is quite extensive in nature. And at the same point of time, the work is not very complex on the surface. What we do is that we need to rethink the assumption that these books are written with a limited vocabulary. And in fact, if we think about other authors as well, such as Dr. Seuss, And if we take some of his work, such as A Cat in the Hat, The Cat in the Hat, or From the Green Eggs on the Ham. So Cat in the Hat was a book which was written with the vocabulary of only 250 words. And similarly, if we think about it, when we think about it, we have the Eggs and Ham, which was written in just 50 words, as you can see in the linguistic narrative and complexity over here, the second point. So the simple act of writing a text with such short amount of word limit actually actually it elevates it to such a level that it is in fact appealing to the children because of its well structure, as well as the adults who are in fact trying to find meaning which is perhaps hidden underneath of this surface. And if we think about A Cat in the Hat as well, there are certain other things which you can understand is that, for instance, if you take a look at the last line itself, it ends with something like, "What would you do?" Where "you" is written in capital letters, or "What would the mother?" Sorry, if your mother asked of you, and it ends with this question. And in fact, "you" both the times is written in capital letters, which in fact prompts the reader to participate in actively solving this ethical dilemma, perhaps. So Seuss's illustrations and dynamic and changing. It's dynamic, it's challenging to the viewer, and despite, or perhaps because of the roots in the tradition of editorial cartoons, these texts that Seuss write, they are unique, they are dense, and they are quite funny, and they are also quite exhilarating to say the least. And despite their immediately recognizable rhyme schemes, they feature unexpected juxtapositions and surprising rhymes, and in fact very fantastical and fantasy filled situations. Moving on, the next one is didacticism and lessons of children's literature. So some children's books are intentionally written in a very instructional manner. The term didactic is often used to describe books that are specifically designed to teach a lesson, whether moral, political, religious, social, or practical. So what you can see is that if you think about Aesop's fables, and if you think about even the simplest ones, such as a crow who is thirsty and who is flying around looking for water, he finds a pot. There is a very little amount of water in it. He starts dropping pebbles into it, and the water level rises. He drinks it up, and then he flies away. Moral of the story: with your own ingenuity and with your own creativity, you can solve any problem. So even the simplest of the stories over here, they have a specific structure to them, as if they are written in a manual-like feature. Now, if you have actually read any manual, for instance, if you have taken a look at the phone manual or even the simple instructional TV manual, what you will find is that these manuals, in fact, they are written firstly in very simplistic nature, secondly in a very sequential nature, and thirdly, in fact, in such a manner in which anyone can follow them. And some of these fables do follow this sort of a sequential writing style as well. And by better understanding the texts which are produced and given to children, we gain a stronger understanding of the broader culture that we live in. By better understanding this text and the sequential nature, we in fact have a broader idea about what our culture and our society is all about. Now, if you think about another critic like Mitzi Myers, she explains that because children's tales perform a variety of cultural functions, they're crammed with clues to changing attitudes and values and behavior. Above all, these key agents of socialization diagram what cultures want their socialization diagram what cultures want their young and expect those who in fact tend to them. That means that, for instance, a children's literature is often quite unadulterated in nature. What it shows you is basically the tendencies and the temperaments of that specific day and age, which you would like to imbibe within your children. And because of it, they provide an unadulterated vision into that specific historical point of time. And some of these children's books they're intentionally instructional as well. And even when we think about books such as, well, Harry Potter, let's talk about Harry Potter for a moment. Harry Potter is a text which we have all, discussed quite, which we have all gone through. And in fact, even if we haven't gone through it, we are quite familiar with it, isn't it? If we take a look at the second quantum here, the transmission of cultural values, the even texts that are not intentionally didactic can teach, influence, and shape the readers. So these 2 points, like the didacticism and the transmission of the cultural values that a certain age wants to impart their children, when we think about both of them, let's consider them in the case of the Harry Potter. Now, Harry Potter, obviously, the first published work, The Sorcerer's Stone, it was in 1997, wasn't it? And it was quite appealing to children and to adults and to old and young alike. And in fact, it combined various elements of realism, fantasy, high school drama, and adventure. Now, this book series follows the exploits of, well, Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley, the three friends, the three titular friends, and how, in fact, they rid the world of Lord Voldemort, the evil wizard. Now, given its widespread appeal, the series and the reader's response, there are several signposts which, in fact, point to the state of cultural concerns. For instance, readers have debated that the series' representation of girls and girlhood has been embodied by Hermione. Hermione appears to be more knowledgeable about magic than Harry and Ron, and her frequent emotional displays also and her need for rescuing create a complex picture of modern girlhood. The series also raises several questions, such as about class-based hierarchies through treatment of house elves. House elves, if you do remember, Dobby the elf, who in fact, spoiler alert, does die at the end, and in fact, how they are treated as the titular American slaves, as well as the treatment of the non-wizards or the Muggles, as it is put, because they lack pure blood. Now, these plot elements, they parallel certain aspects of racial politics and racism, which was quite prevalent in Europe and North America. Now, the series continues to engage with these issues of race and gender and sexuality even till this day, even long after this series has ended. When the actress Noma Dumezwani, who is in fact a black actress, was cast to play as the adult Hermione and Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, Rowling did tweet that in the books, Hermione was described as a person who has brown eyes, frizzy hair, and was very clever. Her skin color was never represented. In 2007, after the publication of the seventh book of the series, Rowling told an audience of fans that she considers Dumbledore to be gay, prompting many readers to revisit their interpretations of this character. Moreover, the controversies surrounding the series because of opposition of some religious communities attest to the continued convictions between secular and the religious cultures. Rowling herself has received criticism for the appropriation of the Native American culture, and also in the Pottermore website, and she has in fact continued to include such sort of instances in her, well, stories, and in fact she continues to provide such interpretations for the story that has already been created and already been ended. Finally, we have the point of pleasure and unpleasure. Now, as you have noted that, see, children's literature, as we can see on the slide itself, can reveal both our greatest pleasure and our deepest fears and concerns. Understanding what pleases or frightens us the most is absolutely the key of understanding what it means and what it means to be human and how human beings relate and treat one another. Now, it has been noted that readers sometimes worry about analyzing cultural text as it interferes with pleasure. We might also note how unsettling it is to be confused by a text or uncertain about its meaning. Learning a new skill or achieving comprehension of ideas can be a great source of relief of, or satisfaction. Now, just as understanding the history of art and artistic movements can help a viewer make sense of the work of an art which is kept at the museum. For instance, right now, if we have noticed the well, you might have noticed it as well that the artwork of the artwork which is called as the Starry Night has become quite popular during the time of the pandemic. and you might see it as you might see it in screensavers or in your wallpapers, the artwork called as A Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. It in fact is a cry from a person and his descent into madness, and that is in fact the actual backstory of how the piece of art was in fact painted. But this sort of a artistic movement, I mean, that particular piece of art became quite uh, relevant during the time that we were stuck in our homes during especially the COVID pandemic. And in fact, people started comparing their situation with Van Gogh, and that is why the painting, in fact, rose up quite a bit in social media and other social accounts. And because of that, even you may be familiar with this odd piece of work, which was not very popular, let's just say, 20 years ago. Now, just by understanding this sort of a work, we derive pleasure from it, understanding this work, and we assign a meaning or composition, or we provide in its place a larger movement in history. Understanding the history of children's literature and how children's literature works can enhance the pleasure of reading it and allow us to reread it and reread it for pleasure. For instance, I can guarantee you right now that a person who has read Harry Potter would have definitely read that particular book at least a couple of more times, because that is a sort of a pleasure which is associated with reading children's literature. And in fact, that goes the same for comic books and nursery rhymes and other forms which are present in this genre as well. Now, if you think about, well, we have been revisiting the work of Carol and Alice in Wonderland. It contains numerous allusions to other literary texts and historical events, isn't it? While the nonsense vocabulary or the strangeness of the characters or the situations which are presented, it allows it allows us to make jokes out of it. Sometimes there are certain jokes that are often missed out as well, which allow us a new sort of a gratification when we discover it later on. It and if you think about it in a similar manner, children's literature can also be unpleasurable in nature. It can generate anxiety or discomfort or depict frightening or disturbing elements. For instance, as we saw in Hansel and Gretel, as I said, starting from cannibalism to straight up gory murder. This disorienting quality of Alice in Wonderland or of Hansel and Gretel could be upsetting for some readers. And in fact, if we think about other such examples as well, such as Heinrich Hohmann's Struckwelpe, you might have seen this image. It's a German boogeyman, basically, who cuts off the fingers, who cuts off the thumbs of little children who do not stop sucking on them. And similarly, if we think about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory of Dahl or Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events, they create this sort of a horrific environment which is very hard to imagine could be enjoyable for a child. And when we think about pieces of literature like this, readers seek out literature which is also terrible for many reasons, which includes helping them work through challenging and horrible experiences or feeling, or also, in fact, provide a sort of a cathartic experience, as you might have learned while studying Aristotle. And with this, in fact, let's end the lecture. And at the very end, I would like to, in fact, provide you another example. Now, in this particular lecture, we have been going through many examples. And since Dr. Mahanta did mention in the very beginning of the lecture about the Jungle Book as well. Now, Jungle Book by Kipling, where we have this young kid called as Mowgli, who in fact is jumping around in his underwear in a forest, who is befriending different sorts of animals, is quite magical and it's quite fantastical in nature, isn't it? However, Kipling was a very well-known man. He was a well-known man for his, well, racist interests. And if you think about the term, the white man's burden as well, it was named because of a poem which was written by Kipling of the same name. You could check it out online later. And when we think about, and when we find the historical, I mean, when we find the background of the author and the poet himself, that is Kipling, we tend to see the term the Jungle Book in a new light. And when we think about all of these, I mean, when we think about all of these points of how critical examination is important, we provide a new point of view from which we can look at the work of Jungle Book. Jungle Book over here is about this kid Mowgli, which in fact is a metaphor for the native black and brown people, for the native people of Africa and Asia. These African and Asian people, they prefer to live in jungles. They prefer to be befriending with animals. They have been shown as similar to animals only. In fact, if you take a look at the Jungle Book itself, what you will find is that Mowgli is not even referred to as a human. Mowgli, time and time again, has been referred to as a man cub, a man who is a cub, isn't it? A man who is, in fact, a cub like animals. So we have this idea of a person who is, in fact, jumping around with the animals, who is, in fact, half an animal himself. Apart from that, if you do remember the ending of the story, what you will find is that we have Mowgli who befriends a young white girl from a nearby village. And when the young girl, in fact, shows Mowgli their settlement, Mowgli is, in fact, very scared because he does not want to get out of the jungle or the dark environment which he has created for himself. And when the girl, in fact, gives him fire, fire, which has universally always been a symbol of human progress, about human civilization, about human technology, what does Mowgli do? Mowgli immediately takes it and burns down half the forest in order to kill Tiger. And that is what we, or that is what, in fact, the native people do when they are provided with progressive technology. And that is, in fact, and that is how, in fact, the whole of Jungle Book is a metaphor for colonialism by itself. And again, we couldn't have known it all if we didn't actually study this particular text according to these points, which I've shown you just right now, which cite the importance of critical examination. So that was all from my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, JP. That was quite enlightening, I would say. Now, students, it is up to you to ask your queries, and our resource person will try his best to answer them. And before you ask the question, let me ask something to our resource person. JP, we have come a long way, right from Aesop's fables or Grimm's tales or our own Panchatantra to this time is Harry Potter. There is a drastic change in nature of these tales or stories. Earlier, it used to be basically created, used to be basically created for with a moral purpose, right? But with Harry Potter, and like all the likes of Harry Potter, modern tales, they are not that simple. They don't specifically deal with any moral purpose, I guess. Do they? I might be wrong.
Okay.
So would that be considered as a progress in this genre of literature, or just a paradigm shift?
Okay. So again, as I said, it's up to the reader himself or herself as to what they could, in fact, understand from these particular stories or these poems or these rhymes by themselves. It's completely up to us what we take away from it. And you're absolutely correct. In the very beginning, if we think about the most oldest of the fables and the fairy tales, they in fact had a dialect. I mean, they did have a very dialectic purpose. That means their primary purpose was to provide you advice on how to live your life. It's mostly like a miracle play, as you can call it. So it's about how you could live your life according to the narrative which has been set for you by your government, by your church, or by your society in itself. For instance, as I talked about the stepmother case, I mean, why in fact the stepmothers have universally been shown as one of the most evil creatures of whole of the land. So it's not really advising you to do anything. I mean, of course, at the end of it, it is kind of advising you not to get remarried, or else your children will suffer. But yes, the modern fairy tales or the modern tales, such as you spoke about Harry Potter, they do speak about it, isn't it? For instance, they do speak about the importance of family, they do speak about the importance of friendship, and in fact, they do speak about the importance of, well, if we think about Harry Potter, then basically why you should, in fact, side with the good instead of the dark side, and why you should be in the why you should, in fact, try to be a Gryffindor rather than a Slytherin. And though at the very last part of the story, they do clear it up a little bit, but still, mostly they also provide you a lot of advice now, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. So basically, you mean to say that the basic purpose has been the same, but the writing style, it has adopted the contemporary purposes or contemporary social standards, right?
Yes, absolutely, you're correct.
For example, when this lady, J.K. Rowling, when she said Voldemort might be gay,
It was Dumbledore.
sorry, Dumbledore.
Yeah,
I tend to mix up all these things.
yeah, it's
Sorry.
okay.
Dumbledore might be gay. Okay, fine. So right now we are seeing these gender fluidity movements. So she is just later on intentionally or unintentionally giving that hint just to fit into this kind of society right now,
Rhetoric, yeah,
where we are living now. Same cannot be done with an older text, I guess.
of course.
And do you think that these children literature, they might include our this series? What was that? I forgot the name.
Which one? The Lord of the Rings one, which you're speaking about, or what?
No, not the Lord of the Rings. Where this was the dialogue, winter is coming.
Oh, Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and
Game of
Fire.
Thrones. Yeah, Game of Thrones. So does it fall under the children's literature part?
I mean, the blood, the violence, and the gore.
if that is there, and so many children literature as well. But the fantasy part, it might help us to put it under the children literature part, I guess.
Okay. Firstly, uh, okay. So Dr. Metu Dosar, she has given us a text. So, okay, first things,
Yes.
like Santuda, you spoke about the Harry Potter and how, in fact, J.K. Rowling is trying to cash in on how she's trying to ride the hype train, especially. For
Yeah.
example, that you were
Yeah.
speaking about
Exactly.
as the gender fluidity movement and everything, isn't it? And
Yeah.
honestly speaking, that is sort of true. She's trying to generate hype in a new sort of a movie which was releasing. Uh, and if you take a
Mm.
look at it, the name of the movie was, I think, Crimes of Grindelwald. It's a spin-off series of movies which have released after the whole Harry Potter saga has come. And she was trying to generate hype in the whole thing. And honestly speaking, that is very true. That this was sort of a revision which was done after the original text was published. And although the original text has not been modified as of yet along these regards, yet this particular piece of information does provide you new insights into the character. However, that is the same in almost all the children's stories, don't you think? For instance, think about the Hansel and Gretel tale. But
Mhm.
Brothers Grimm published it at least, published and republished it at least 8 times during their whole lifetime. And each
Mm.
time, some of the things were changed. For instance, the one which I showed you, where the brother and sister ride a swan to their father. That particular aspect was added only in the fourth edition.
Mm.
That was not available in the beginning. For instance, if you think about Ring Around the Roses, Pocket Full of Posies, and all of that,
Mm.
the third line was something like Ashes, ashes, we all fall down, which was very grim.
Mm.
But now, when we are reading it for the nursery kids, that aspect has changed as well.
Yeah, that's a jolly song now.
It's a jolly song. And you, in fact, yeah, you hold hands with your friends and then you revolve around each other, basically, and all of that, isn't it? It's not
Again,
about death
again,
and
again, that
decay.
that nursery rhymes is there. London Bridge is falling down.
That is true. It's about the Great London Fire,
Great
isn't it?
London fire. Yeah,
So that is why you have to build it up with iron bars because
iron bars
iron cannot actually burn like wood.
easily.
Yeah, it'll melt, of course, but yes, it cannot burn
It will
as
take some
easily
time.
as wood.
Yeah,
So you have to
and
build it up with iron bars.
Mithu Dusad has thrown some insights that now the stories are more inclusive because of the target audience. This brings a new idea that yes, earlier the text used to dictate the reader. Now the text depends on the reader.
Welcome to capitalism, right?
Exactly. Advent of printing, advent of the market.
Hmm. No, that is true. That is very true, actually. I mean, nowadays we have this sort of a progressive crowd, which, in fact, if you take a look at the social media, which they are called as the woke people, WOK, woke people or woke culture. And there
Mm.
has been literature, there has been cinema which has been targeted towards them. Think about even the most simplistic of the Hollywood blockbusters. Okay, they
Mm.
never generally show Chinese people in a bad light because they have to market it towards them.
Mm.
For instance, even if your movie flops everywhere else, if it works well in China, it's going to do well. Similarly, if you find, as in the very beginning, you were telling us about Rings of Power, right?
Yeah.
We see that elven warriors, which were originally described by Tolkien, were fair creatures of the wood,
Mm.
isn't it? And now we
Yeah.
see a person of a darker complexion being an elf.
Yeah.
So think about it what you will. I mean, is it something which
It's all about
Tolkien,
marketing.
yeah, is it something that Tolkien would have wanted? Perhaps not. But this
No,
sort of
back at that time of Tolkien, it
Hmm,
was quite unthinkable that
of
a
course.
black man might be that powerful or that black man might be that important.
Hmm,
During the days of Tolkien, it was fairly an incomprehensible idea.
of course. I mean, Tolkien was a person who fought in World War One, if I'm not incorrect. And
Yeah.
at that
Is it
point of time, even when they were losing, they wouldn't like the help of the African American community for the war
white
effort.
supremacy?
Exactly. Even if you're losing, you wouldn't like to win with I mean, African American people. So why
हारेंगे
are you going to put them?
हारेंगे घर से हारेंगे.
Pretty much, isn't it? So yeah.
Okay, students, do you have anything to ask? Some people are sending messages in WhatsApp, I guess. Let's see. No, not in
All right.
WhatsApp.
We have a question over here. Oh, what do you think is the objective of incorporating violence in children's literature? Is it important from any angle? Of course, it is important. I mean, think about it in this manner. So, children's literature, it's quite binary in nature when you take a look at it, isn't it? For instance, there is always a proper white, there is a proper black, and there is very rarely in between. And that
Mhm.
is why, if you can, in fact, categorize something into very binary opposites, into a black and a white, into a zero and a one, into a good and a bad, into an Occident and an Orient. Let's not get into that. But yes, if you can divide it into such distinct categories, violence becomes important because you need to show that the evil is vanquished. You have the capacity of defeating evil altogether. But yes, is violence necessary? I mean, yeah. For instance, I was telling you about the German boogeyman, right? Who in fact cuts the thumbs of little girls who don't, I mean, who suck their thumbs too much. So yes, that sort of violence. It's basically a cautionary tale that yeah, you shouldn't suck your thumb too much if you are a girl, or else the boogeyman is going to come and he's then going to cut off your thumb altogether. So it could be a little bit of a cautionary tale as well. And secondly, if you have already established two distinct categories of good and evil, then of course you need to show that the good is in fact vanquishing, is going to annihilate, is going to obliterate, is going to demolish the evil. And yes, that is why it's required. Dr. Mitchell Desart is also saying that Maleficent 2, the love between a mother and a child, is being highlighted rather than Prince Charming. Yeah, unfortunately, ma'am, I haven't watched that particular one as of yet. I have heard that it has subverted the original fairy tale, but I haven't gotten an opportunity to watch it yet.
Even though Angelina Jolie was there.
Yeah, even to Angelina Jolie was there, of course. Still, I haven't been able to watch it yet. I mean, it sort of seemed a little bit boring, so I skipped it.
Yeah, not that boring.
Oh,
It's
it
it's a
is.
bit slow, I would say. It's a bit slow, but not that boring.
All right, I'll put it in my watch list then.
Okay, sure. Anyone
Uh,
else? Someone has just joined after more than 1.25 of an hour past the time. Okay, I guess that was all. Thanks, JP. It was a very wonderful session,
yeah,
and actually, it feels good that my roommate has been delivering such a wonderful lecture, which I have never had the opportunity to listen to before. Because earlier you were not a teacher when you
right.
were staying with me. We were staying together that time.
Yeah.
So now I will like to invite our head of the department, Dr. JYOTI Bora, to offer the vote of thanks. Divyata, are you there?
Yes, Santulan.
Yeah.
Thank you, Santulan. I, on behalf of the Department of English, HPV Girls College, Golaghat, offer my sincere gratitude to Dr. Jyoti Prakash Pujari, Assistant Professor, Christ University, for accepting our invitation and delivering the 7th lecture of Guruvani series. Dr. Pujari's exploration of various aspects of children literature was deeply insightful and thought-provoking. Thank you, Dr. Pujari, for your highly illuminating and enriching lecture. Next, I would like to offer my gratitude to my colleague, Dr. Santulan Mohanto, for hosting the program so beautifully. And I also thank my colleagues from the department and students, and specifically Dr. Mithu Dusat, who is here, for attending today's lecture. With this, I would like to conclude my vote of thanks. Thank you. Over to Dr. Santulan Mohanto.
Okay, so this is the end of the session today. And JP, we'd like to have you again with us some other time with some different topic. So be prepared.
Happy.
And
I'd love to.
yeah, we will also like to know about your experience today. How did you feel?
I mean, firstly, I would like to thank you for inviting me on discussing about children's literature. It has been it is a topic which I have been interested in for quite some time now, and I haven't. I mean, I did have courses on it, but I didn't have a lot of experience speaking on it, especially to students who are outside of my own university. So it feels amazing meeting all the students and you and Dr. Bora as well. And it was an amazing experience speaking about the topic which I like, and especially if it does help out the students in any manner, then it would be, yeah, it would be causing me great excitement. And yes, if you do require any others, then I'd be happy to be here.
Yeah, we will again have you among us in future, in near future, in fact. And as you were saying that this is your first lecture outside your university, but it was quite a fluid lecture and quite illuminating. So you did not to fear that
Hmm,
or
understood.
doubt your capability that whether our students will be understanding it or not. They did, I guess. And
Of course it is.
though many of them haven't asked any questions, but this is something new for them as well. They haven't, they had never thought about children's literature from all these angles. Never thought about criticizing or going beyond the text, which we also somehow felt from the syllabus point of view to analyze children's literature from all these perspectives. So it will help them to look at things which started to them. So it was a wonderful session. So thank you once again. And with that, we are going to close the session for today. Good night, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Satula. Good night.
Good night.